Our first speaker will be Medea Benjamin, best known as the co-founder and omnipresent imaginative protester of Code Pink. I actually have known her a long time, but I learned some things from reading her bio, so just indulge me for a minute. She has master's degrees in public health from Columbia University and the New School right here in Manhattan. Worked for 10 years as an economist and nutritionist in Latin America and Africa for the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, the World Health Organization, and the Swedish International Development Agency. And from 1979 to 83, I did know this, she lived and worked as a journalist in Cuba. She's best known as the co-founder of the fantastic human rights group Global Exchange, and also Code Pink, Women for Peace. And if you don't know, she's a fantastic writer too. Her book on drones was like a primer for me that gave me a lot of what I needed to know. Her most recent books are Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the US-Saudi Connection, and Just in Time for Trump to Scuttle the Iran Deal, or to violate the Iran deal. Her new book, Inside Iran, The Real History and Politics of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Everyone, please give a warm welcome to Medea Benjamin.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to be here, and it's a great pleasure always to hear the wonderful Professor Noam Chomsky. And as a linguist, I thought I might start out just by taking one word that I want to pull my hair out every time I see the mention of Iran, and that's the word meddling. Do you see that everywhere? Iran is meddling in the region. So we can't keep this nuclear deal because of Iran's meddling in the region. Well, first of all, you never see that word associated with the United States in the region. I think we ought to tell the media every time we see it and hear it is please talk about the meddler in the region, which is the United States. And then also talk about the US meddling in Iran. And I thought it was important after I wrote a book on Saudi Arabia to write a book around Iran and not, to see some of the similarities and differences in those countries. And one of the things that is really striking is how much that CIA coup in 1953 that overthrew the democratically elected government of Mossadegh has the ripple effect that we see today. I mean, it was a, quote, successful coup, and the CIA thought it did a successful coup. But it certainly did very clearly pave the way by reinstalling the Shah, by the Shah shutting down all the democratic institutions that were there for people to express grievances, leaving the only place where people could organize being the mosques. And led to the 1979 overthrow of the Shah that led to the Islamic Republic, with the most organized sector of the community there being the religious sector. And the overthrow in '79 was not just anti-Shah, it was, of course, anti-American because of all the meddling that the US had been doing in Iran's internal affairs. And that meddling continued every single day after the 1979 revolution, which included things like constantly trying to overthrow that government through covert activities, hundreds of millions of our tax dollars that have been spent in those covert activities, trying to find some segment of the population, a lot of times the minority groups in Iran, that would rise up, and arming Iran's neighbors, and then crippling sanctions. Those sanctions are not new. The sanctions have been in place in one form or another ever since the 1979 Islamic Revolution. The other thing that you hear constantly the Trump administration say, and repeated by Democrats and Republicans in our Congress, is that Iran is the #1 exporter of terrorism in the Middle East. I think we have to unpack that. Some might say that the US is the #1 exporter of terrorism, but if you look at Middle Eastern countries, certainly if you look at where is the ideological basis of Al-Qaeda, of ISIS, of these extremist groups, it is not in the Shia religion of Iran, it is from the Wahhabi perversion of Islam that was the foundation of Saudi Arabia and continues to be the religion that is not only taught inside Saudi Arabia, but is exported from Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is by far more of an exporter of extremism than Iran is. And let's never forget that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, and yet why is the ban on Muslims that the administration has imposed bans the people from Iran, where there has never been any Iranian involved in any terrorist activity in the United States, but doesn't include Saudi Arabia? Not that I want them to include it, because I don't think we want that ban at all, but just stating the obvious hypocrisy there. When you look at a comparison of Saudi Arabia, our great ally, the #1 purchaser of U.S. weapons, and Iran, in the book I spend a lot of time criticizing Iran. It certainly is a government that doesn't allow for democracy to flourish inside Iran, and I have given many, many examples of that. But if you do compare it with Saudi Arabia, Iran comes out better on every single aspect, from its treatment of women. There's a much stricter guardianship system in Saudi Arabia than there is in Iran, to the institutions inside the countries, where Saudi Arabia doesn't even pretend to have any kind of national elections, where at least in Iran, while the elections are vetted as to who can run, there is a big interplay every time there are elections, and it does matter a lot what faction wins those elections. Professor Chomsky talked about nuclear issues and the call for a nuclear-free Middle East. This is something that Iran had called for way back from the days of the Shah, but I find it particularly galling to see Benjamin Netanyahu with his theatrics come before the TV cameras in English, of course, not addressed to his people, but addressed to Donald Trump, and do his proof of how Iran has been trying to get nuclear weapons all along. And yet you don't see the most obvious thing pointed out in the US press, which is, what about Israel's hundreds of nuclear weapons, never joining the NPT treaty, never allowing for international inspections, the gall, the chutzpah of Bibi Netanyahu being the one to call out Iran on nuclear weapons. Trump is listening to the repressive regime of Saudi Arabia, to the apartheid regime of Israel, and not to our allies in Europe. And he's also put in power people in his cabinet who have a history of calling for not only being against the Iran nuclear deal, but also for regime change in Iran. And that is the replacement as Secretary of State with Mike Pompeo, the replacement at National Security Council of John Bolton. And those two of them have been openly calling for regime change and supporting a group that is called the MEK. Have you heard of the MEK? And now it has many other names with its political arm. But they are not the only ones close to Trump supporting the MEK. Sally, you talked about Rudy Giuliani, and how could New York ever have elected Rudy Giuliani? Rudy Giuliani just last week was the keynote speaker at the MEK political arm, the Iran Freedom Conference that took place in Washington, D.C., and gave the most disgusting speech that you could imagine, where he talked about this group would be meeting the next year in Iran. A little bit just about this group. The MEK, it is all very reminiscent. You remember the days when there was Ahmed Chalabi and the Iraq National Congress that was being groomed even the United States, leaders who had spent almost their whole lifetimes outside of the country, had no base of support inside Iraq, and they were the ones that were going to take over once Iraq was liberated. Well, this is deja vu all over again, but even worse, because the MEK is an organization that until 2012 was a terrorist, known as on the terrorist list in the United States, but is known as a terrorist organization, had suicide bombers, sided with Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war, hated inside Iran by people of all political stripes because they sided with Iraq during that horrible war, and has been called by many groups, including the conservative RAND Corporation, a cult organization. And this is the group that Rudy Giuliani is supporting, that John Bolton has spoken to 9 different times, and that they have been getting lots of money. They spread lots of money around so that they get people on the right, conservatives, they get people on the left like Howard Dean supporting them. And it is suspected that the largesse is actually coming from the Saudis. So here we have Donald Trump calling for, pushing for this kind of regime change. And what we are already seeing since he pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal is an increase in tremendous conflict in the region, with the back and forth now volleying between Iran and Israel, both inside Syria and the Golan Heights, and a tremendous potential that these skirmishes can really get out of control. The U.S. needs Iran to solve not only the issue of Iran getting nuclear weapons, but all of the conflicts in the Middle East. There will be no solution to any of these conflicts unless we work with Iran. So where might we go? I see I'm already getting a 5-minute warning here. We have a situation now where the Europeans are talking tough to the U.S. Professor Chomsky just said how much the U.S. controls the world economy, and Rainer Braun, we were talking to earlier about how the Europeans talk tough, but they always cave. But it's an important moment to recognize that at least there's tough talk going on right now. The Germans are really pissed off by the U.S. ambassador who got there and just in his first week in office put out his tweet that said, as Donald Trump said, U.S. sanctions will target critical sectors of Iran's economy. German companies doing business in Iran should wind down their operations immediately. This was not appreciated by, in his first day in office. So you have the Germans saying, whoa, wait a minute, don't talk to us like that. You have the French saying they want to consider blocking statutes that would permit European companies to ignore U.S. sanctions, and that any decisions by foreign courts would not be upheld. You have calls for financially independent banks that would separately finance transactions with Iran. You even have calls in the EU for proportional reprisals, including penalties against assets of U.S. companies based in Europe in case illegal fines are imposed. Now, is that all just talk? We don't know, but it's important for us to be supporting these efforts and be reaching out to our friends in Europe to be saying yes to their governments, let's move ahead, and that their companies should not be penalized for Donald Trump's ridiculous move. Also, to recognize that the winners and losers in this, the losers are the Iranian people. Iranian civil society already is feeling a crackdown. Iranian people knowing that the sanctions will hurt them. You know, the Boeing and Airbus had these $20 billion deals that look like they're not going to go through. I don't care about Boeing's profits, but I do care about the planes that have been crashing in Iran. Iran has among the oldest latest fleet of airplanes. They are on an average 21 years old. It is very dangerous to fly planes in Iran. And I will move now just towards the end to say, what can we do? I think that we have to first show the Iranian people that we are disgusted by what Donald Trump did and that we do not support his actions. We put out a letter, an apology to the Iranian people. One of our first signers was Professor Chomsky. We have people like Jane Fonda, Eve Ensler, Oliver Stone, Danny Glover, but we need lots and lots more people, so please go on the codepink.org website. We are printing it in Iranian papers starting next week and getting a lot of support for that. We also want to work with our European peace groups to see how we can not only strengthen what their governments can do in terms of fighting back, but also organize an international peace delegation to Iran to show our commitment to working with the Iranian people. And the other thing is about our Congress. There were a lot of people under Barack Obama who supported this deal, and they have been all too quiet now in this past week. So demanding that our elected representatives speak up against Donald Trump withdrawing us from the Iran deal and the danger that imposes. And I just want to end by quoting a little from the letter that we wrote in apology, saying that unlike our president, we believe a deal is a deal. Unlike our president, we want to resolve conflicts in the Middle East, not escalate them. Unlike our president, we want to live in peace and harmony with the people of Iran. We will do everything in our power to stop Donald Trump from strangling your economy and taking us to war with you. Please accept our hand in friendship. May the peacemakers prevail over those who sow hatred and discord. Thank you.
When the UN was set up at the end of World War II, the very first task it gave itself, Resolution 1, we need a plan to eliminate nuclear weapons. It was seen to be such a fundamental challenge to the fate of the world. We still have no plan. The international order that was put in place has failed to meet its very first and most overwhelming priority. The public response to nuclear weapons in many places was to seek its elimination, so including very prominent people. I'll just take one example, Albert Einstein. Einstein is famous for many of us in the peace community for having said that nuclear weapons have changed everything except our way of thinking. And I'm sure you've all seen some variation of that quote. It turns out he was wrong. They didn't change everything. As a matter of fact, they didn't change most things. They should have changed everything. But what we've actually seen since then is that nuclear weapons became integrated into business as usual by states, and by scientists, and by governments, and by people. It became just another thing. And what we did was that we institutionalized nuclear weapons into bureaucracies. Governments with nuclear weapons had departments responsible for nuclear weapons. Armies, air forces, navies incorporated them into their nuclear warfighting and plans and so on. It became careers. Right? You got your degree in science or engineering and you became a nuclear weapons builder, designer, maintenance person, whatever. Or you became one of the people who sat underground in a missile silo with the key ready to launch nuclear weapons, or a pilot who was going to fly a bomber with nuclear weapons, or a submariner, etc., etc. It became part of regular budgets, and it became a set of ideas about how the world works. None more compelling and widely shared than the idea of nuclear deterrence. It became so obvious as a piece of common sense to the world that to actually unravel that from how people think about nuclear weapons is a task we have yet failed. You have any conversation with almost anybody about nuclear weapons, and the first thing they'll say is that, yeah, it's because the other guy has nuclear weapons, and if we have them, they won't do anything. This particular piece of wisdom goes back to even before the first nuclear weapon was ever made. Right? The idea of building nuclear weapons in Britain and in the United States came out of a notion that if Germany during World War II gets nuclear weapons, how do we deter this? How do we prevent them? And how do we confront them? And the idea was, well, if they have it and we have it, then perhaps that'll be some kind of balance. So we have yet to undo that idea in most people's minds. So the failure of success in getting rid of nuclear weapons in the first so many years, and the fact that they generate crisis, because they're part of the normal business of governments, and governments have crises, governments have wars, nationalisms, interests, trade, so many things lead to crisis, lead to confrontation, and nuclear weapons start to play a role if countries with nuclear weapons are there. So what you see was that we invented arms control as a way to try and regulate and manage the danger, because we couldn't figure out how to eliminate them. And now you fast forward from 1960, 61, 62, when the first ideas about arms control took root, to now, and that whole management structure also is in crisis, and some people say it is actually failing. Critical arms control treaties have come undone. So one of the pioneers of American arms control thinking, the late Tom Schelling, once argued that the anti-ballistic missile treaty signed between the United States and the Soviet Union, where they basically said, look, if we try and defend ourselves against each other's nuclear missiles, it'll just fuel an arms race, because then I'll build more missiles, you will build more defenses, I will build more missiles, you will build... So the way to regulate this is to agree not to try and build defenses. It's counterintuitive, but it does help manage and limit the scope of nuclear arms racing. So Schelling, for many, many years, argued that the fact of the existence of this treaty was proof that people were capable of restraint, and that arms control was a way of stabilizing the international order. Well, we know what happened. The United States withdrew from the ABM treaty. So we now have only 2 countries that have ever withdrawn from treaties related to nuclear weapons issues. One was the United States, which withdrew first, but no. One was the United States, the second was North Korea, which withdrew from the NPT. And now we have questions about the future of the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed between the United States and the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. The US accuses the Russians of violation, the Russians accuse the US of violation. There is reasonable grounds that both are actually, in fact, correct in their accusation. But rather than try and resolve this, both of them are now thinking that perhaps we should just force the issue. So the larger structure of arms control is also coming undone. And so we get back to the problem of the international order is unable to resolve these issues of nuclear weapons. The process of management of these issues is coming undone. And the nuclear weapons ban treaty that was agreed last year was a new effort to try and find a new path to resolve this. And what we saw was that it is a UN treaty, right? It's sanctioned and mandated by a General Assembly resolution. It's not an agreement that exists outside the UN system. This is a product of the UN system. And the nuclear weapon states stayed away, and in some cases, some of them have actively tried to prevent it being agreed, and now are actively trying to stop countries from signing it, to prevent it coming into force. This adds to the problem of the crisis of the international order. If the international order is built around the United Nations system, and you have a United Nations system agreed treaty, and states are trying to undermine that treaty, then what is the purpose and role of the system? Right? What do we do? The order is now useless and being undermined by its own leading members. So it becomes hard to imagine how we can get ourselves out of this. And to just kind of connect this to where we are with Iran, one of the things that's worth thinking about is that many of you will have seen Donald Trump's statement about the US withdrawal from the agreement with Iran. The first thing to remember is that the original agreement with Iran was not a UN agreement. It was done by the United States, Britain, Russia, France, Germany, etc., as a separate agreement between parties outside, and it's not a treaty. But they took it to the United Nations. And they took it to the United Nations Security Council. And it was unanimously endorsed by a Security Council resolution, which that resolution says all member states are required to support the implementation of the Iran agreement and to not do anything to prevent it. What the United States has just done is to basically violate a Security Council resolution. I mean, it's not the first time, of course. I mean, you remember the Iraq War and so on, but the fact is that in this particular case, we're now seeing multiple examples of the great powers on one side being at odds with what the international order and international system is seeking to manage, and saying we don't care if that's what the international system of states seeks, we're going to do what we want anyway. So the crisis of legitimacy of the international order is now coming into full view. And we have to deal with this. Otherwise, this system may well fall apart, because it can't take too many crises where nobody respects and accepts what that system is for and what it does. So the second part of it is this question of the democratic process, and brings me back to Einstein. So Einstein said, as I mentioned, that nuclear weapons have changed everything except our way of thinking, and I think he was wrong in that. But what he did do was, but he was also an activist. I mean, he was a socialist, a pacifist, an activist as well as a physicist. And so in 1946, Einstein and others, including Linus Pauling, founded something called the Emergency Committee of the Atomic Scientists. The name actually tells you something. It was an emergency committee. And the committee, Einstein wrote letters to physicists all over the world asking for money. It's the first fundraising letter that I know of on nuclear weapons issues. And it says, we are trying to raise $1 million. In 1946, $1 million would have gone a long way. We're trying to raise $1 million to educate people around the world on the dangers of nuclear weapons, because, he says, the basic power of the universe, that is nuclear weapons, cannot be fitted into the outmoded concept of narrow nationalisms. And the scientists believed that there is no possibility of control of nuclear weapons except through the aroused understanding and insistence of the peoples of the world. We believe that an informed citizenry will act for life, not death. Okay, so he got money. They helped found the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. They helped fund the Doomsday Clock, which 2 minutes to midnight, so this is where we are. It turns out that the emergency that they were trying to deal with has become permanent. We live in a state of nuclear emergency that has now lasted since 1946. People have become used to it. And the aroused insistence of the peoples of the world, it turns out, is not sustainable on a long-term basis. Whereas the bureaucracies and careers and institutions and budgets that governments have in place are able to stand year after year after year, in part because the nuclear weapons themselves and the careers and the interests have longevity, whereas people's movements and civil society have a much harder time. The lifetime of an American nuclear weapon system is measured in 40 years or 50 years. The nuclear modernization that is now underway will put in place over the next 20 or 30 years nuclear weapons that will last 50 or 60 years. We will have nuclear weapons until the end of this century. And the groups that we have, Peace Action, American Friends Service Committee, and others, that's where we have to deal with this. We are in this for the long haul now. The idea that we had at the end of the Cold War that this is done, no more existential war between communism and capitalism, etc. It turns out that the late British historian and peace activist E.P. Thompson was absolutely right in thinking about nuclear weapons. He said, nuclear weapons are a system of exterminism that has its own logic and will replicate itself. And what we found is that in the absence of superpower competition between communism and capitalism, if you believe that formulation or not is a separate debate, but that is what they told themselves and us it was about. That's been gone for 30 years. And yet there are still thousands upon thousands of nuclear weapons, and core postures about how these weapons are to be used remain the same. I mean, we're lucky to have with us Bruce Blair, the founder of Global Zero, and one of the people who has done the most to teach us about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the postures that are in place and the opportunities that we have to try and deal with some of these challenges in an immediate sense and in the long-term sense of having a plan for getting to zero. But the fact of the matter is the Cold War fundamentally changed nothing. That when it went away, we were left with these structures of exterminism that continue regardless of the ideological underpinning. They have taken on a life of their own. And I fear that we now have to take much more seriously than we have done before, that we need to rethink our entire relationship to this question of what it means to live in a nuclear-armed world, and the kinds of strategies and options and organizations we need to build to deal with this danger. Because everything we have tried so far, and we have tried heroically, there is no doubt about it, there are genuine heroes in our movement. People of great creativity, great determination, who've made great sacrifices. It has not been enough. So with that slightly sad but honest, in my opinion, judgment, I think we now face a whole new set of challenges, and we need to grapple with that with our eyes open and a much greater sense of self-reflection and humility about the fact that, at least in the United States, it may be time for the American peace movement to realize that we need help. And we have to go figure out where that help can come from. But it is time to realize the United States and the American peace movement cannot drive the train that will abolish nuclear weapons. We're going to have to go ask people for help from all over the world and say, come here, come talk to our citizens, come talk to our town councils, city councils, elected officials, and help us make the case that we have been unable to do ourselves, that the United States and the other nuclear weapon states, right, are a fundamental threat to both world order and the continued existence of humanity. But the United States by itself and its peace movement and its democratic process is not able to meet this threat. We need help. So come help. Thank you.
That may have been inadvertent, but it's a great transition to our next speaker. Ask and ye shall receive, because we have someone who is one of the, I would say, preeminent ambassadors for peace and nuclear disarmament, not just from Japan, but of all of our allies in countries all around the world, Hiroshi Taka. During the 1960s, he was a leading figure in the Japanese student movement. In the 70s, he served as secretary of the World Federation of Democratic Youth in Budapest. He visited Chile under the Allende government, Vietnam, including meeting with Ho Chi Minh, and other countries. In 1984, he joined the Japan Council Against A&H Bombs, Gensukyo, one of, again, leading peace and disarmament organizations around the world. He was the Assistant Secretary General for International Relations, and he excelled in that role and still does, I think. In 2000, he became Gensukyo's General Secretary. He also served 2 terms as International Peace Bureau's Vice President, one of our sponsoring organizations today. He is currently the Representative Director of Gensukyo and co-chair of the steering committee of the organizing committee of the World Conference Against A&H Bombs. Please welcome Hiroshi Taka.
I want to express my gratitude to the organizer for sponsoring this conference with a very timely topic. And also I want to express my gratitude for this opportunity to speak before you. I think this conference commemorates also or congratulates the winning of the Sean McBride Prize of the Professor Noam Chomsky plus Jeremy Corbyn and their Okinawan anti-base campaigners. I commend the IPB for this good decision. The task of abolishing nuclear weapons, along with the settlement of international conflict disputes by peaceful means, these are tools that form the starting point of the international politics after the end of the World War II. Even at present, the abolition of nuclear weapons is an unfinished agenda to be achieved all by international politics and through the mobilization of the world public. While we face still the danger of nuclear weapons actually being used, it is important to note that the abolition of nuclear weapons represents the major trend of the time, representing the voices of the overwhelming majority of both people and their governments. Those who are driven in a corner is not us. It is a nuclear weapon, pro-nuclear forces. The treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons adopted by the United Nations Conference last July with the support of 122 countries has been signed now by 58 countries, ratified by 9 countries since it was opened for signature on September 20, 1917. The resolution to promote the signing and ratification of the treaty adopted in December by the UN General Assembly was supported by 125 countries as against 39 opposition votes. 39 is not a small number, actually. But of them, 28 are NATO members, mainly in Europe, and a few others, also US allies, such as Japan, Australia, Israel. Japan's opposition is truly regrettable for us. As the only country to have suffered from nuclear disaster in the world, it should have taken the lead in the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Yet the global trend supporting the abolition of nuclear weapons is irreversible. The time and reason are on our side. The recent agreement between North and South Korean leaders to set the reunification of Korean Peninsula, formal end of the Korean War, and the establishment of peace, and the denuclearization of Korean Peninsula as their common goal is another evidence of it. Though the future path will not be easy one, what changed the course are the diplomatic efforts of the governments concerned for the peaceful settlement of the problem, plus the principle of denuclearization supported by the broad range of international opinion. It is thus amply clear that the anachronistic policy of relying exclusively on military pressure, including nuclear blackmail, and reject the dialogue as a waste of time, has gone bankrupt. Japan is the only country where people suffered the calamity from the atomic bombings. Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution declares the renunciation of war, the non-possession of forces or any other war potentials, and the negation of the right of belligerency. It is based on the reflection, severe reflection of the past war made by Japanese leaders. Nevertheless, the Japanese government opposes the nuclear weapon ban treaty, while talking about its role of so-called bridging between nuclear and non-nuclear states. In terms of denuclearization of Korea, Japanese government kept saying that holding dialogue is a waste of time. When President Trump threatened North Korea by saying all options are on the table, Prime Minister Abe telephoned him saying that we highly appreciate your decision. And when he had talks with the Korean President Moon Jae-in during the period of the Olympic Games, Abe tried shamelessly to place pressure on to urge Korean President not to postpone the Korean-U.S. military exercises scheduled shortly after the Olympic Games. Underlying these blatant words and conducts is his ambition to make Japan the so-called first-tier nation that will serve and participate in U.S.-led wars by fanning fear of China and North Korea taking advantage of the tension over the issues of the Senkaku Daiju Islands or latter's nuclear development by changing the international, by changing the interpretation of Article 9 to enable the exercise of the right to collective self-defense, and now expressly changing Article 9 to recognize the self-defense forces as former military force. At the time when he was the Secretary General of the governing Liberal Democrats, Abe visited the United States. He made a speech at a neocon think tank, American Enterprise Institute, in April 2004, and he pledged that Japan would play an active role in the U.S.-led global security strategy, and that to this end, he said, he would change the Japanese constitution. In the Japanese Diet, the advocates of the revision of the constitution occupies the 2/3 of the both houses, upper and lower houses. The number needed to initiate the process of changing the constitution. Their position was secured through the manipulation of public opinion using the fear of external threat, so-called external threat. Extremely unfair election system in favor of the ruling parties and money from establishment and pork barrelling. It is something like this system in the United States. Yet a steady stream of change is going on in favor of peace and also against nuclear weapons. One remarkable change going on is the development of cooperation between various political parties, namely almost all opposition parties, and citizen groups. And the cooperation is going on both national and local levels. Now it is working for the defense of the Constitution, peace, and elimination of corruption, against the government violation of the Constitution using the force of the majority in the Parliament and repeated scandals. The waves of such cooperation, which brought on the 100,000 people towards the end of 2015, against the warlords continues. In Okinawa, those people who represent the conservative forces, they now came together with anti-base people, and in 2014 they won the governor. And the next election will take place in November. As it was last time, we hope that the U.S. peace movement will continue to support Okinawan people in their struggle against against the new base to be built in Okinawa. Thank you. All these actions are bearing fruit. On or around May 3rd, it is a Japanese Constitution Day. The media conducted, as it does every year, opinion polls. And then it reflects something new. That is, for example, the Asahi Shimbun, one of the major newspapers, roll results say that the revision of the Article 9 to expressly write the self-defense forces is supported by 39% of the answers, while 53% opposed it. Asked if the revision be made during Abe's tenure, Abe Prime Minister Abe's tenure, the 30% said yes, but 58% said no. According to the NHK, a major TV station which is known for pro-Abe, sometimes it is called the Abe channel, conducted the poll in April. Some 7% of the answers said that they appreciate Article 9 positively, while altogether 30% said not or hardly appreciate it. Therefore, the change of constitution, they need the majority support from the people. So Abe's program is to make sure that the change will be made and the new constitution be enacted by 2020. But according to these figures, it can't happen. In the movement against the English bombers, the trend of near cooperation is spreading in joint signature campaign at the grassroots in response to the call by the leading被爆者 for a treaty to ban and eliminate nuclear weapons issued in April 2016. Many citizen groups working for different issues form local networks to run joint campaign. Now, these networks are formed in 26 prefectures out of 47. In Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even mayors and governors are standing with their citizens in the street, just making a speech and calling for their signatures to their citizens. Simultaneously, we are organizing and approaching the local government and local assemblies, local councils. And we have asked some 259 local assemblies have passed a resolution calling the national government to sign and ratify the treaty banning nuclear weapons. It represents some 15 or 16% of the total number of the local assemblies. It is rapidly increasing. In coming August, we will convene the 2018 World Conference Against the NH Bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki with a common theme of the nuclear weapon-free, peaceful, and just world. To build even wider cooperation to achieve Japan that will work against nuclear weapons and abide by Article 9 would also be our motto. We have already started the various campaigns. Our peace march has started on May the 6th from Tokyo and from northern end of Hokkaido toward Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I bet that in August you'll witness many more changes and fruits of our activities. I look forward to seeing you in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. Thank you for listening.
So our last speaker is not here in person, but technological wizardry will allow us to hear his remarks remotely via Skype. Daniel Ellsberg is best known among the authors and whistleblowers who in 1971, in an attempt to end the Vietnam War, released the Pentagon's secret history of the U.S. decision-making from the beginning of the war, better known as the Pentagon Papers. Of course, he was then sentenced to 109 years in prison, but that was thrown out later. If I'm not mistaken, he was on Nixon's enemies list, as was Professor Chomsky. And to think about that for a minute, if Nixon were around today, might that be an improvement over, the current president? In 1961, Dan was a consultant to the Department of Defense, and he drafted Secretary Robert McNamara's plans for nuclear war fighting. He lectures and writes on the dangers of the nuclear era and the need for whistleblowing with a credibility that very few people have on both of those topics, obviously. He's a senior fellow at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. He's the author of Secrets and his most recent book, The Doomsday Machine, Confessions of a Nuclear War Planner, which I highly recommend. He was the subject of the Oscar-nominated documentary, The Most Dangerous Man in America, and of course he's a key figure in the recent Steven Spielberg film about the Pentagon Papers called The Post. He's also just one of the kindest people you could ever meet. There he is. Everybody, say hi to Daniel Ellsberg.
Thank you very much. I couldn't hear any of the previous speakers. I did read Noam Chomsky's essay last night. Very good. What kind of country is Noam describing there, our country? Clearly not one that observes any constraint from the UN Charter, which it has ratified, or from that matter, from our own Constitution. We're an empire. I would call it a covert empire, covert meaning subject to plausible denial, meaning not only that something is secret and denied, but that it is plausibly denied in the sense that evidence is provided, false evidence, selective evidence, misleading evidence, that denies the reality of who is doing what and who is in charge. The fact that we are an empire has been denied for a long time. On the contrary, our self-image is that of one that freed ourselves from the world's mightiest empire in our founding, and that we have been supposedly anti-imperial ever since. That's false. Also, the means by which our empire is managed are denied and covered by plausible denial. Assassination, torture, like other empires, we use the means of empire in generally, with one exception. In fact, we are exceptional in one respect. And it isn't torture, it isn't assassination, not bribery, all these other media of regime change, which is of the very essence of empire, deciding who is to rule, who is to die, and who is to live, who is to govern other countries in our empire. All of that is the unexceptional aspect of our empire. The exceptional part is that since 1945, as an instrument of empire, we have created and deployed a machinery that could destroy most life on Earth. The nuclear aspect, the machinery of what I've called the doomsday machine, is an American contribution. And to regard that as an instrument of empire is our contribution to the practice of imperialism. We're not alone in that. From 1949, our monopoly was broken. And I must say that although the Pope, for example, has called the very possession of nuclear weapons, especially now, a morally condemnatory act, and the reasons for that should be clear enough. I can't find it in myself to say that it was morally condemnatory for the Soviet Union wanting to maintain its tyrannous control of its own people and its defensive, I would say, mainly occupation of East Europe, defensive against the possibility of a resurgent Germany, nevertheless tyrannous in itself. In order to maintain that, they acquired nuclear weapons in the notion that that would deter or neutralize the threat of American nuclear weapons against them. Likewise, China, facing hostility from both the Soviet Union, in the early 60s and after the early 60s, and the US, I think I can't condemn, actually, for acquiring nuclear weapons, which may actually have made it less likely that an American use of nuclear weapons in circumstances where we continued to have a monopoly, possibly had China not had nuclear weapons, the use of them in Vietnam, as former President Eisenhower urged on President Judson, in a little-known fact. That might have occurred. In any case, deterrence can work. After all, kidnapping can work. The blackmail of various kinds can work. They aren't all caught or convicted, people who do that. Certainly, President Trump has been using the threat of nuclear weapons, actually using our nuclear weapons, I would say, in the way that other presidents have done very often, dozens of times in the past. Used them when he points them at the head, essentially, of Kim Jong-un, someone whose assassination we practice. That wouldn't require a nuclear weapon, but or invasion of North Korea, but also the possibility of fire and fury such as they have never seen. Now, actually, when he makes that particular threat, he may or may not realize that, in fact, the North Koreans have experienced fire and fury to the extent of the destruction of virtually every man-made construction in North Vietnam by fire and incendiaries and bombs in the early 50s. They have experienced that at the hands of America. And he's simply, one might say, adding the clear implication that this time might be nuclear. Harry Truman had already threatened that in 1950. Eisenhower secretly threatened it in 1953 and came to believe that his threats had been crucial. Almost surely wrong in terms of the Korean armistice, which has not led to a peace treaty to this day. But nevertheless, he believed that. His vice president, Richard Nixon, believed that and imitated that in Vietnam without success, actually, in 1969 and 1972 and on other occasions. So sometimes the threats are believed to have worked, sometimes they may actually have worked, sometimes not at all. And in those latter cases, they may not have been necessary, or they may have been bluffs. Hard to say. I'm not convinced that all of them were bluffs. What does this instrument of imperialism, which continues to this day now, mean for the future of our species? Most of you, I think, have seen pictures of the remnants of Nagasaki after an atom bomb, a plutonium implosion bomb, was used on it in 1945. And you've seen a bare landscape, what was once a city, with a few concrete buildings still standing. What you don't see are the people who were in those buildings, who were in that empty space. The other iconic image we have of that period is the mushroom cloud, as over Hiroshima, rising into the heavens, into the stratosphere, in fact. And again, you don't see the people under that. So that's an empty landscape, but it was not initially a desert. However, so imagine then the shadows of the people who were eliminated by that blast. Actually, almost no one, I think, has seen pictures of Tokyo on after March 9th and 10th, 1945, some 5 months earlier. It looks almost exactly the same. The iconic pictures, as I say, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are really not different from what the heart of Tokyo looked like after the immense firebombing of March 9th, night of March 9th, in which more people died by fire, burned alive, or boiled in canals that were boiling in the firestorm that resulted. Thousands of people boiled on that night. It looks the same as Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The only difference is that it took about 300 bombers to do that to Tokyo, and one bomber sufficed each for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But in terms of moral or strategic difference, that doesn't make any difference, after all. We had 300 bombers. In fact, we put 1,000 in the air on August 14th as the Emperor's surrender was coming back before the bombers got back, was coming to the U.S. before the bombers got back in the last raid of the war, 1,000 plane raid. The 200 to 300 bombers went night after night over Tokyo, again in Tokyo in May, but over 64 other cities in Japan for 5 months before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So the moral decision to wage war by killing civilians was taken even before 1945, especially by the Nazis and the Japanese and the British. The Japanese did not make that a way of waging war. The Germans used it in the Blitz and against in London, but it was the RAF and then the US that picked it up as the central role of the Air Force in a major way of waging war. Thus, the atom bombs that came along were simply a more efficient, cost-less, more efficient ways of massacring civilians, which by then was a tool of America, not acting in that instance so much as an empire as in pursuing a war that had, after all, been begun by others. The extension of that instrument of war into the post-war period came very naturally, especially to Curtis LeMay, the chief of Strategic Air Command, who had, in fact, commanded the raid, not in the air, because he knew the secret of the atom bomb. He didn't want it captured visible, but in his headquarters in the Marianas. And the actual raid was accompanied by General Thomas Power, who became, after LeMay, the head of Strategic Air Command. So nothing could have been more natural for them than to pursue their mission as head of Strategic Air Command with, at first, atomic bombs. And by the end of the Truman administration, there were more than 1,000 operational atomic bombs, mostly targeted on cities in the USSR. When Eisenhower left office, there were nearly 23,000 weapons, nuclear weapons, of which most, or more than half, were thermonuclear weapons, and that's a difference that most Americans don't really understand as a historic difference for our civilization and our species ever since. I found that in most audiences today, if I ask how many feel they know the difference between an A bomb and an H bomb, only 4 or 5 people raise their hands, and the others aren't just being modest. If I ask how many don't know, they do raise their hands, the audience as a whole. I don't know if that's true of this select audience, but it might be. And the way I describe that to them very simply is this. When you're looking at a picture of the devastation of Nagasaki, you're looking at what happens to the heart of the city when an explosion occurs in it of the trigger to a modern thermonuclear weapon, an H-bomb, a fusion bomb. Every such weapon, every H-bomb, has a Nagasaki-type plutonium implosion bomb as its detonator, its percussion cap, you might say, its trigger. And the early forms of that were 1,000 times greater than the Nagasaki bomb in explosive yield, which in turn was 1,000 times greater, 20,000 tons equivalent of TNT, 1,000 times greater than the 20-ton blockbusters of World War II, which were called that because they destroyed a city block of buildings. When Trump used what was called the MOAB, the mother of all bombs acronym, earlier this year, it was described as the largest bomb ever dropped. That's simply untrue. It's equivalent to the large bombs, 20-ton bombs, the RAF was dropping in World War II. But the Nagasaki bomb was 1,000 times greater in one bomb than those bombs. And the earliest H-bomb were on the order of the first one we dropped exploded was 15 million tons equivalent, or 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima bomb of 13 to 15 kilotons. And later we had bombs of 20 to 24 megatons, million tons, 1,000 times greater than Nagasaki. These are the instruments we've been threatening and building and are proposing to rebuild now at a $1.7 trillion program of modernization begun under Obama and continued and somewhat enlarged under Trump. Now, however, the Russians, since the mid-50s, 60s rather, since the mid-60s, have had a quite equivalent two doomsday machines on hair trigger alert confront each other with possibility of false alarm in each, could arise over a conflict in North Korea, in Syria, in Ukraine, not immediately in Iran, but I think very likely nuclear weapons would be used against Iran, as Vice President Cheney was urging in 2006. This, then, is the human situation, that the entire world is hostage to the false alarms and the buildup, the policies of these two states in particular, and to a lesser extent to the 7 other nuclear weapons states. As Noam indicated, this is a species problem. All of our members of our species are threatened by it. Everyone has a stake in changing the policies of all of these nuclear states, but above all, of the US and Russia.
Thank you, Dan. We do have some time for Q&A.
Thank you very much. Each of the panelists were extraordinary today. Dan, can Dan hear us?
No, I think that was just not going to happen.
We have a lot of fantastic new energy the past couple of years in this topic, and I was going to ask him, since he's had a lot of experience with movements over decades, how he can come together as a group, because we have groups of new groups that are single issues, and we have people who have been at this for decades, and we need all the help we can get to come together as a movement. Thank you for asking for help, Pia.
Well, I certainly echo what Zia said, that we need help. I'm not sure where that help is going to come from now, because I think the entire globe needs help. We used to have a strong anti-nuke movement during the 80s. I know we used to have a very strong anti-war movement at the time of the Iraq War under Bush. That fell apart under Obama, where we thought he was going to do it for us, or some people thought he was going to do it for us. And there were other issues like the financial crisis and many other things that took people's attention away. It's been very hard since then to build a peace movement that could mobilize people in any significant numbers. And Kevin, you certainly know this as well as I do. We've been trying very hard. And one of the things that we have realized that we have to do is connect our issue to lots of other issues. And one good example of that is the Poor People's Campaign, which will be launching on Monday, in which Reverend Barber has really taken on this issue of militarism as one of the core issues, going back to Martin Luther King's triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism, and now adding the climate destruction to that. And he gave a really amazing sermon last week in Washington, D.C. that's now getting out on the internet that you can see, and we're going to get it also in written form, because it's quite spectacular to see somebody like him, who has a tremendous standing among the Black community and has done so much work in North Carolina that's now spread to so many other states, that has brought these issues together, to see him bring the militarism focus into that in such a clear way. So we now have a chance during the next 40 days of the Poor People's Campaign, in which the third week of that campaign is dedicated to the issue of militarism. So hopefully our people around the country who care about this and are participating in the Poor People's Campaign will show in that third week that we can come out in significant numbers. So that's one thing we can do. We used to have a Pledge of Resistance, and remember, it really started during the time of the Central American Wars, where many thousands of people pledged that at a certain time of escalation of U.S. involvement, they would do civil disobedience, and many people did that civil disobedience during the 80s. I think it's time to revive that Pledge of Resistance, the kind of thing that MoveOn has done, saying if Mueller is fired, that we will come out on the streets. Well, I also think we have to say, if the U.S. is moving us into war with Iran, we have to come out on the streets. So, you know, MoveOn, it's not, sometimes they'll like get involved in these anti-war issues and sometimes they back out. So you can't really count on them, but I think we should be talking to them, try to take that same group that has made the pledge, and of course try to do our own getting people to pledge. But I think those are some ideas of what we have to do. We do have Trump's military parade that's coming up in November, which is on Veterans Day in Washington, D.C., and there are groups that are already meeting now to do counter kinds of gatherings. Much have been led by veterans themselves, with Veterans for Peace, the group About Face that used to be Iraq Veterans Against the War, taking the lead on some of this. So those are some of the things that we have out there. We do need help, and I think actually a lot of the help can come from people here in our own communities and people who are involved in other actions. So I think we should be open for anybody who has ideas, because we need them. Thanks.
I think also just briefly to connect what Medea just said, but also Taka and Zia and Noam, is in addition to learning or asking help, that we need to be humble and be in solidarity with people's struggles, and particularly struggles for sovereignty. I'm glad Taka mentioned Okinawa. I've been to Okinawa. It's one of the most beautiful places on earth, and the people's struggle there against U.S. bases is one of the most incredibly inspiring things I've ever been a part of, and also the people of Korea opposing the Jeju Island base, opposing the THAAD, but also right now what's going on in terms of the incredible leadership by President Moon in South Korea. It's not just about peace between the Koreas, as important as that is. It's about reclaiming South Korea's sovereignty as the junior partner in this alliance with the United States. All right, we have time for a couple more. Okay, yeah. Please.
I'd like to ask a question of Julian Leva. I was very encouraged by what you said, and you gave me some hope that there will be new and more leadership from young leaders in this struggle, and I'm wondering if you can just tell me about that a little more. It's really important.
Of course. So what I noticed at March for Our Lives when I first began organizing is I believed, I was under the impression, the false impression, that I was in this alone, that no one was going to be advocating, and this was a day or not even 2 days after Parkland, the massacre there, the tragedy that happened there. But what I recognized is in doing how would I describe it? In doing a demonstration, an individual demonstration is seeing the passerby, seeing all this frustration and all this almost exhaustion through all these student bodies, because this was in the center of all these different colleges and universities. And it gave me this inkling of just hope and faith, and what it allowed me to recognize, what it allowed a lot of other students to recognize, is this ability that we had, that I had seen in history books in the 60s with the suffragist movement, with labor movements way before, that we may be, in fact, just the next generation moving forward in this struggle for solidarity, for peace, for nonviolence. And if we stand in the footsteps of the people who came before us, and if we recognize what they did right, also what they did wrong, but always be cognizant of history, that we were allowed so much liberty to pursue this in a unique and very liberating way. And I think one of the aspects, I think it's almost a double-edged sword, is the element of social networking and of Facebook and all of this, and it's allowed a lot of mobility as well. The question is, and one thing that I know a lot of the National March for Our Lives organizers are wondering is, how do we sustain a movement? I believe that it is through expansion that we sustain it, and that's what I'm trying to push out in Boston and as well with the national leadership there. So I think this is a huge example over here, because a lot of the people in this room have been doing this for generations. And this is something that is truly, it's a very humbling, I feel like I'm just part of this cause that is far greater than March for Our Lives. It's true. And what Noam Chomsky has been able to do, what you've been able to do, Joseph Gerson, with your work in Phoenix as well, it's tremendous to just see all this. And I feel like one day I know I'm going to be in your shoes, worrying about the next end of the world. It's never going to happen, though, I promise you. There's a lot of hope.
Let's just take a couple more real quickly.
How could a word not be said yet about Syria? Syria is where the battle is right now. It's where Iran, where Russia, where Israel. In other words, if there's a hot spot right now, it's overshadowed by what was done with Trump withdrawing from the Iran treaty. But how could this be a discussion without the context of what's going on in Syria?
Thank you for asking that.
Yeah.
It's actually, and it's not just Syria, it's also Yemen. And the first thing that comes to my mind is that if you kind of flash back, and many of us are old enough to have this flashback, to Reagan and the early 80s, and the heightening of the Cold War, the risk of nuclear war, the new nuclear weapon systems. At the same time, there was the war in Lebanon. Right? And the American peace movement talked about the freeze, but not so much about the war in Lebanon. And you are quite right to ask this question, and I think we need to be paying more attention to what's going on in actual zones of conflict where some of these issues actually involve themselves. And I would add to the Syria situation, 500,000 people have been killed. There's been catastrophic destruction of an entire society. But there's a space that opens in that in Syria, you can actually see that they have agreed rules on how to kill Syrians, right? They deconflict. It's the word that they use. That when my Air Force is flying, I'll tell you where my planes are, so you can not shoot them, and I will not shoot your airplanes, and so on and so forth. Talking about the US and Russia, and there's also some degree of other deconfliction between the Iranians and the Americans and the Turks and so on and so forth. It's not so much the case between the Iranians and the Israelis, but they too will develop rules about how to manage this. Whereas what we're talking about when we come to nuclear war is that while rules for managing conflict on the peripheries of great power competition, it takes them time, but eventually they've learned how to get there, how to manage this in crisis so they don't actually end up triggering a real war. But sometimes stuff happens, right? And one of the things that we need to worry about is the stuff happening part. But it is, in my opinion, connected to this question of international order, right? If ever there was a purpose for the United Nations, it was to make sure that stuff like Syria doesn't happen, right? And no one is letting it do its business, right? The Russians aren't, the Americans aren't, nobody is. And this is part of the crisis, that there is this gap that opens up when you have nation states making policy, international organizations, and people. And so the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what would it take for the United Nations to actually do its job in Syria? And the answer is that we have to get the United States and the Russians to move and allow for a settlement that can actually end the fighting. And we can advocate all we want here in the United States. The question is, what does it take to change Russian policy? You have to be serious. In the actually existing world, the United States does not always get its way. And when you have these multinational conflicts with competing great power interests, you have to have ways of thinking about what will it take to get the other sides to play a role in this process. And we have not given enough thought to this question. In the same way that we haven't given enough thought to why is it that the countries in the Baltics and Eastern Europe are actually very supportive of American nuclear weapons policy, because they are worried about Putin. So where is the connection between the American peace movement and people in Poland and Latvia and Bulgaria and Romania and Hungary who are thinking, look, we need NATO, we need nuclear deterrence, we need extended deterrence. We need to have that conversation with people in Eastern Europe, in the Baltics, and in Russia to talk about, what does it take? Because it's not just the case of, we get to decide everything. So I think it is actually very, very complicated, but we do need to recognize that there are limits on what the US can do by sheer force of determination, and will other people have a say in this? And we need to have those conversations with those people urgently.
That's also a good commercial for Reiner, who I'm sure is going to address the NATO question. Okay, this is our last one, and then it's lunchtime.
So as a follow-up to that last point, I'm a retired Army officer, and in 2002 I had a paper pass my desk that stated our policy was to not allow anyone else in the world, any other nation in the world, to even have the ability to cause us to hesitate in our decision-making. So your point about Putin and Russia, I think we need to have that conversation within the United States about why it is that we have a policy that is so draconian that we won't allow any other nation to even challenge or cause us to hesitate in our decision making. And I think that's the issue here. We're not going to allow Syria to have any independence. That's what's driving that war. We've been engaged in Syria since 2009, triggering it with our CIA and Joint Special Operations Command. I think we need to look at ourselves and try to resolve why it is we become such an aggressor now, versus trying to push the blame onto other countries.
Thank you. Any last word from our panelists, or should we wrap up and go to lunch?
On that last comment, I think one of the reasons that the U.S. has been so anti-Iran is because Iran has been challenging U.S. dominance in the region. But just a couple of other things that occurred to me that we should have said when we talked about what we can do. Obviously, we have elections coming up. We have to send a major, major message to the guy in the White House that we will not continue to allow the Republican Party and Donald Trump to take us in the direction, but we also have to send the message to the Democratic Party. And that's why I think we have to bring up these questions during the elections. We have to go to the town hall meetings. We have to push our elected officials and people running and support the people in primaries who are taking much more progressive stands. We obviously have to change our political system and who is supposed to represent us. Lastly, I want to say that so much of what we've been talking about, including what Ziad has said about the professionalism and the jobs and the careers that come with nuclear weapons, is to emphasize the profit that comes from war. And when I mentioned that I don't care about Boeing's profits, I read something pretty awful that Boeing said, well, if we lose this deal with Iran, it's $20 billion, that's too bad. But it also, they didn't say it exactly like this, but this is what they meant. It also means that there'll be more conflict in the region, and so we make a lot of money from conflict. And these companies do. And that's why a new campaign that we have called Divest from the War Machine is so important. We're working with Peace Action and a lot of other groups on this, but I think one of the components of it, it's not only to get our churches, our synagogues, our our cities, our universities, to look at the connections we have to the war machine, but it's also to go to our politicians and say, you vote on the Pentagon budget every year. You vote, that Pentagon budget is actually money that goes directly to these corporations that then give you money for your campaigns. And we want you to pledge not only to take no money from the NRA, which is a very, something that a lot of young people care about right now, but also not to take money from the weapons industry. So we hope you'll join us on getting the elected officials and anybody running for office to take a pledge to not take money from an industry that makes its profit on killing. Thank you.
I see a few people are voting with their stomachs. I suggest we all do the same.